Welcome to WCAT. I'm Kiki Latimer, the host of the Catholic Bookworm, and we have with us today Father Edward Foley, Capuchin, who has written a wonderful book, which I've read most of it, called Preaching as Paying Attention, and the subtitle is Theological Reflection in the Pulpit. So welcome, Father Ed.
Thank you.
Would you like to start us off with a prayer?
Sure. We open our hearts to the presence of God and pray that God's holy word, the divine Christ, through his Spirit might open us to attending to that word wherever we encounter it, so that we might respond with energy and joy. We make this prayer through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So it was fun. I have just finished publishing with Sebastian a book on homiletics. So it was wonderful to read your book, which was a different take on it, but every once in a while we kind of cross paths.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about both your background and what motivated you to write the book?
Well, I'm a Capuchin priest who has taught liturgy and some preaching for some 40 years. I have a couple of graduate degrees, including a PhD from Notre Dame, and for a long time was a professor at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, where I mostly taught liturgy and presiding. But when you teach presiding, you listen to a lot of preaching. And also, I have been an active preacher in basically two parishes in the Archdiocese of Chicago for probably about 30, 35 years. So it's my own pedagogical concerns about what preachers are learning and how they're evolving, and it's also about my own evolution as a preacher. So actually that motivated me to write a book probably about 20 years ago on preaching that liturgy training publications asked me. It's still in print, but they asked me to rethink it and do something a little new. So it was their impetus that was behind this.
You have a lot of experience in the pulpit.
I was ordained a presbyter in 1975, so I've been doing this for 40-some years, yes.
So in your book, you discuss the sciences a lot.
Right.
Do you want to talk to me about that a little? Because it was very interesting.
Well, part of it is related to a larger project that I'm doing on preaching with the sciences through the John Templeton Foundation. They've given us a grant through Catholic Theological Union. My concern in general is that I don't find a lot of preachers terribly imaginative. And so for me, it's about imagination. Because we're imagining God and we're imagining our journey to God. And we're trying to help the baptized to continually reimagine their journey as they move through life. And I just find the science is enormously imaginative, that scientists are always dealing with mysteries, trying to solve the unsolved mysteries. And also that when I went to college 1,000 years ago, most people were getting a degree in the humanities. Over 60% of the people when I was a college student were getting a humanities degree. And today that's under 20% in the United States. And the vast majority of people going to college are getting degrees in STEM, science, technology, engineering, math. And that's a group that the Catholic Church is not doing a great job connecting with, young adults. So it just strikes me that both it's so imaginative and the scientists give us incredible analogies, but also that it's maybe more part of the world that we need to move into so that we can have a dialogue with and learn from young adults.
Well, we certainly need outreach to young adults. There's also the concept of that there's a huge divide between faith and reason and faith and science. So bridging that gap would be important.
Right. And I mean, the interesting thing is our current Pope actually I think his first degree was in science. And theology itself in the Middle Ages was considered scientia. It was considered a science. So I just find that, and there's some great writing on this. Ian Barber has probably got the best book on it, on science and religion. But I think that they're mutually beneficial. I actually was recently invited to give a lecture to a couple of hundred scientists from across the world, many whom have completely different belief systems than myself. And my whole goal of the lecture was to tell them how important their imagining is to me and to helping me reimagine the faith journey through quantum physics or neuroscience, or actually it was a conference that was focused on vacuum tubes. But I mean, their minds go places that mine don't. And just like God's.
Yes.
You know, God's mind is not mine. So my job is to expand mine.
And tapping into the imagination in the pulpit, within the homily, does capture people's attention.
Absolutely.
And I find you mentioned the use of stories quite a bit.
Right.
I mean, obviously Jesus used stories. We all love stories. I coach storytellers, and in the storytelling community, per se, it's always, there's nothing better than a good storyteller and nothing worse than a bad storyteller. So teaching people how to be storytellers and how to tap into the imagination is very important in homily, it would seem to me.
Absolutely. I mean, in
and
some
bridging
ways,
that gap for young people. Who, as you mentioned, they're sort of leaving the church in droves these days, or attending sporadically. So when they are there, you want to catch them and speak to their heart in something that makes sense to them.
Right. Well, I mean, storytelling, it's both important theologically, because as many scripture scholars will note that even Amos Wilder famously talks about the Hebrew Scriptures, one of the fundamental strands of narrative that go through the Hebrew Scriptures is storytelling. And as you mentioned, Jesus was a celebrated parabbler. I mean, he knew how to tell a story. But also what we're learning is that from the sciences, from psychology and even from neuroscience, that storytelling requires active participation. If you tell a good story, if you're an effective storyteller, there's a gap that's created by the storytelling, and the person who's listening has to fill in the gap. So that it's sort of like telling a joke. When you tell a joke, the joke works if somebody fills in the gap. That's why if you work across languages, one of the most difficult things is to get people to fill that gap because they don't always know the context. So a story allows people to it's actually a form of active participation in the preaching, so that they're not simply not just getting information, but they themselves are trying to connect the dots. And my job is to get enough dots out there that people can connect them in their own way. Not in my way, but in their way.
Yeah, you have to reach a point in the homily where you receive an image, where you get that, where you can connect the dots and you get an image, and that image can stay with you. Make it out, I always say, make it out of the parking lot,
Absolutely.
You mentioned cultural references in your book, and you had a concern that this might seem like you're pandering to sort of the lower levels of the culture.
Well, I mean, making cultural connections is responding to the contextual nature of all preaching. There is no such thing as universal preaching.
Right.
Just like there's no such thing as universal theologizing. All theologizing, like politics, is contextual. Now, some theologies have resonance across more contexts than others, but preaching has to be contextual.
Right.
And part of your credibility as a preacher is resonant with a community that understands that you know what's going on in the world.
Right.
And even Pope Francis does a brilliant thing on this in his Evangelii Gaudium, the Joy of the Gospel, where he says one of the problems with preachers is that they think that it works in their head and therefore it's supposed to work in everybody else's.
And it doesn't.
No. The job is the other way around, is how does one get into other people's
Right.
ways of thinking, and popular culture is an indicator of what sparks people's imagination. So it's some would call it it's a form of Christian humanism, where you start with what's human and you start
Right.
what's experiential,
Absolutely.
but you don't stay there.
Bishop Barron has done a great job of going out into the culture, reviewing the movies that everybody is seeing, tapping into what's good, pointing out what's not good, but tapping into what's good in films, books, and you have to know what people are, reading and doing out there.
I'm a little cautious about critiquing the arts, and one of my mentors, Nathan Mitchell, always used to say people suspect that God loves Mozart more than Randy Travis, that we love the poor but we hate their art. So I try to be a little cautious about what I try to do is use something that might have some appeal and get people engaged. I do not want to use the pulpit as a place for critiquing the arts, or it's easier not just not to mention that and to go someplace that's more grace-filled than moralizing. Right.
But certainly mentioning things, you mentioned the movie Frozen.
Right.
Which obviously every child in your parish is going to see that.
And their parents.
And their parents. So a cultural reference to that certainly would get their attention. It's like, oh, Father knows what we went to see, Well,
also there's wisdom in some of these. So I use the example of Frozen because one of the lead characters, everything she touches does freeze. And it happens through her hands. And I was preaching specifically a homily at a time when the President of the United States and the Speaker of the House weren't even shaking hands at the State of the Union address. There's something going on when we can't even do that kind of most human engagement. Right. So that frozen hands are an indication of frozen hearts, and that's not what Christianity is about. So it seems to me that those are maybe entertaining images, but they often have quite potent wisdom in them.
They do. And again, images that people can remember and take home with them. Frozen hearts, frozen hands, frozen hearts. There's an image there that's easy to hold on to. That's good. You mentioned also in your book, which I loved, the importance of bringing important cultural events into the homily. I've been at Mass when, especially when something horrible has happened in the community. I talk about it in my book, Home for the Homily. Something's either happened in the church community, the hometown community, the national community, or the world community, like 9/11 or, some terrible thing. And it's on everybody's hearts. Everybody's thinking about it. Everybody's weighed down by some event. And then it's not mentioned in the homily at all. And it's like, hello, like, who are you? Do you not know that the sheep are in pain over this event that has occurred? And I when I was teaching homiletics, I remember saying, like, if you have a homily planned, Saturday morning and Saturday afternoon, something horrible happens. you have got to find a way to bring it into that homily, even if it obviously wasn't in it on Saturday morning. It's got to be there Saturday night and Sunday morning. You can't just pretend, well, it happened after I wrote my homily, so I'll talk about it next week. It's your community in front of you is in need of your recognition of the event, and they need healing for the event. And so if Father from the pulpit doesn't even mention the event, it's very disconcerting for parishioners.
Or deacon.
Or deacons.
Well, I mean, part of the impetus was that there was anecdotal information that after 9/11, a lot of people did not preach about 9/11. It was mentioned in the Prayer of the Faithful. And some folk, and there was actual writing about this in the Journal America, that they said, well, it wasn't in the readings. But it's a very narrow understanding of Roman Catholic. Well, also Roman Catholic law does not require us to preach on the readings. Those are central, that we continue to engage, but the Constitution and the Sacred Liturgy says, the readings or other sacred texts, like including Eucharistic prayers or prefaces, and the mystery being celebrated.
Right.
So it's not only if it happens on Saturday afternoon. When I'm preaching on Sunday morning, one of my jobs is to get up early enough, not only to get vocalization and have a body that's working, but also to find out what happened overnight.
Right. Yeah.
I'm actually going to be doing I'm preaching. I've accepted a fellowship at the University of Notre Dame in preaching this fall, and I'm going to be teaching one advanced course in preaching. And one of the exercises will be inviting these preachers who have already had a semester of homiletics to take what they consider their best homily. And that morning, each one of them will be given something that happened that morning. And how do they improvise? And improvisation is an important part of preaching. You have to improvise both when things happen before the preaching, but sometimes also things happen during the preaching. So you have to be attentive when children are crying, or somebody has a heart attack, or the fire alarm goes off, or the lights go off, or the air conditioning goes off. How do you're a person, you have to respond to the environment.
Right. Yeah. I was at a mass once where someone, I don't know if they had a heart attack or whatever, but something bad happened in the middle of the homily. The priest stopped, the EMT and the ambulance people came in, they got the person, they took him out, and the priest just went on with the homily as if nothing had happened. It's really fascinating.
Right. Well, we don't teach people improvisation ordinarily. And we have a lot to learn from, just like we have a lot to learn from the sciences, we have a lot to learn from people who do this professionally. And one of the keys in improvisation is that you have to go with what somebody gives you. And so sometimes the liturgy, what happens when the microphone goes out, or what happens when you lose your place, or I have actually have students I had a student once who very, very gifted, who was an epileptic, and he had a strategy. What happened if he had a minor little stroke when he was preaching? And he was prepared to respond to that. But he practiced the improvisation. I think that's what we need to do.
I had someone attempt to continue their homily, and they did continue their homily over a screaming child who was not being taken out of the church. And, I say in my book, you're not going to win that battle.
Well, I think there are strategies if there is I'm always delighted that there's somebody out there who's alive. Okay?
Right.
And so we don't want to shame,
yes.
we don't want to shame parents. Part of that is having a broader pastoral strategy, that your ministers of hospitality have to be able to give people options without embarrassing children, saying,
right.
We've got this open space that your kid might find more comfortable. There are giving them options. And then if somebody's making noise out there, my instinct is not to raise my voice. You're not going to win the shouting match.
Right. Don't shout.
But by lowering your voice and by taking more spaces than usual that might expose a disruption, sometimes that helps people be more aware of the disruption and handle it.
Right.
But my job is to stay on the outside as pastoral. I mean, preaching is also an act of pastoral care.
Absolutely.
So I have to stay as apparently unruffled and as caring as possible. And then I can have a meltdown in the car on the way home.
Having a sense of humor gets us through a lot. Things happen in life, and things happen during the homily.
Things happen in the church.
So I asked you to send me a few questions, and one of the things I always ask is, your target audience, who are you hoping to reach, and what were your main things that you're hoping people will take away from your book?
Well, the target audience, broadly speaking, are preaching clergy. So in the United States, for Roman Catholics, the number of bishops, priests, and deacons is the largest single denominational preaching body of any group of clergy, in North America. But there are also lay folk who preach in a variety of different ways. And so I wanted to write it in such a way, and that, as in some of my other writings, I edited a handbook a while back, Handbook for Catholic Preaching. The title did not say Roman Catholic preaching, but right. Catholic preaching. So that there are many Protestant preachers, homilists who are lectionary based, who do preach in a what I would consider a Catholic style, right. Engaging with the liturgy. So that was the primary group. And that dictates, therefore, the design of the book. And I had edited a preaching magazine a number of years ago, and our research showed that a lot of Roman Catholic clergy, for example, they're daunted by an article that's more than 2,500 words. That they have to read in snippets. And so part of the design of the book was that there are no footnotes, that it was written so that it could be read sectionally. You could also read it, you don't have to read it from the front back. And you could take a chapter, and I mean, it's one of the shortest books I've ever written. You could take a chapter and read sections of it over a week or two, right. And you wouldn't lose the continuity. So that was and to try to model in the book, which is why I do cite a number of my own homiletic ventures, excerpt, to say, here's the idea. How do you preach with the arts? How do you preach with literature? How do you preach with music? And then to say, here's one example of how I did it. But also to scatter, like even the idea you had mentioned earlier about preaching with the sciences, is that scientific images are not just in that one chapter, but they're scattered throughout the book.
Right.
And the rhetorical concerns are scattered throughout the book. So hopefully it was modeling in a somewhat subtle, but hopefully accessible way, some of the main points of its very design.
Now, you and I both mentioned the number of unchurched people, I call them unchurched, at funerals and weddings. These situations where you have an opportunity to reach someone who may never be in a church again. They don't go to church, any church, whether it be Roman Catholic or Protestant, most of their life, maybe never. But now they're at a funeral or a wedding or occasionally a baptism. And so you have this opportunity to reach people who really haven't heard about God's love.
Or my language, I mean, there are many ways to talk about them. There's the language of those who are, and Pope Francis talks about those who have no religious affiliation. Because I think it's larger than, the problem with the unchurched language, from my perspective, is that you also get people who are never baptized, you get Sikhs, you get Hindus, you get Jews, you get Muslims, and there's an unmosquing that's going on. There's an unsynagoguing that's going on. And there's also evidence that even the people who are there and are baptized, who are often going through what one theologian calls deconversion, that they no longer agree with the teachings of the church that they're actually apparently affiliated with. So my task is to recognize that they're there.
Right.
And if they're not there in person, they may be there online.
Okay. Interesting now, right?
Absolutely. And in a very simple way, and it's a little humorous, but in a very simple way, I want to demonstrate to them that the Roman Catholic community is not completely stupid in coming to them as collaborators. And this is what Pope Francis talks about in Evangelii Gaudium. It says, some of the people who are unaffiliated are still some of our most important, he calls them precious allies, for human dignity and for standing up for rights and for, so I want to, and it's a little bit the style of what the great theologian David Tracy talks about, is saying if religion, without having to convert people to us, we still can collaborate with them on global commitments and global needs. And so our preaching is one of the ways we say, I'm a credible dialogue partner with you on this. And that also suggests different strategies for preaching. So in my preaching, I ordinarily do not start out with doctrine. Because I think if you start out with doctrine, that people who, even the affiliated who may not agree with the doctrine, I think it puts them back into looking at their cell phone. But if I begin with the human experience, as you were talking about, what's going on in the world, or what's going on in culture, or storytelling, or then it's easier to invite them in. And I just like Jesus' disciples experienced his humanity before his divinity. And so my job is to engage them in the human side of Christianity and the human part of Christology, and then move to the divine. If they want to follow me, great. If they don't, at least we've shared a spiritual space.
Right. You have a wonderful quote. Do you have the book handy there? On page 22, you have a beautiful quote by Madeleine L'Engle.
Oh, yeah, she was...
who's one of my favorite writers. I haven't read her in a long time, but...
she's really quite magical and certainly has a way with words.
Yes, she does.
22. Oh, yes. We do not draw people to Christ by loudly discrediting what they believe, by telling them how wrong they are and how right we are, but by showing them a light that is so lovely, they want with all their hearts to know the source of it.
Oh, I just had never heard that quote. It's really beautiful. And it says so much very succinctly.
Well, it's like Pope Francis's point about saying, too many people up there look like they've just come back from a funeral. Right. And that's why his joy and his enthusiasm for the world and for the people of the world, not always for what they do, but for the joy of gospel living. And I think we have a responsibility to to radiate some of that hope and always give people hope.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it was beautiful to read her words. Like I said, it had been a long time, and I always joke to people. There's a scene in that, and if you've ever seen the movie is it Harry and Sally, or Harry Loves Sally?
Right.
I want what she's having. And does anybody want what you have?
Right.
I've seen, like you're saying, I've seen, been at a mass, and I look up there and everybody looks very unhappy, and the priest looks unhappy, and the homily is unhappy. And I think, I don't want what he has, and probably nobody else does either. So, showing that joy in the mass that should be there, that Thanksgiving joy, and bringing that joy into the homily, and sharing what you have, such that, that someone's, like she says, sees that light and would like to know its source.
Absolutely.
I want what he's having. So that's really important. I think I know you do mention it. I can't think of exactly where in your book, but that division that we often find of us versus them. There's a famous, I don't know who the bishop was, but he said something, I have it somewhere in my book, something effective. We want everyone to feel included, from us all the way down to them. Often this comes out in homily where, the priest or the deacon is talking about, you need to do this and you need to do that, rather than we all are in the same boat together. You bring that out in your book. You want to discuss that a little bit?
Well, I think it's part of one of the fundamental premises of the book is that preaching is an act of theological reflection. And theological reflection is basically asking, where is God in these events? But we can't do this as outsiders. We have to do it as insiders. And it's one of the great changes, and a lot of these are fundamental liturgical and not just preaching principles. The fundamental theology of the Vatican II liturgy is that it's done by Christ, head and members. I mean, it says that in the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, and it says it in canon law. It says it in the general instruction that the liturgy, different from the pre-Vatican II liturgy, which was done by the priest, and all of his language, the Latin was all singular, I, me. But the liturgy of Paul VI is a we, us. And if it's something that Christ does head and members, then the preaching, which is not just in the liturgy, but the preaching itself is a liturgical act. The preaching also has to be done by Christ, head and members, so that the assembly is not an audience. They're not, and the priest is not the subject of the preaching. The subjects are Christ, head and members, and the preacher's job, the deacon's job, the bishop's job is to facilitate that dialogue.
Right. I refer to it as a dialogue, that the homily is a dialogue, and people look at me like, what? I was like, oh no, it's,
Pope Francis uses that language, and in Evangelii Gaudium. So that's why this image of, I had a great teacher who said that image on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel where God is reaching out in the creation of Adam, but Adam is also reaching back. Adam is not completely passive. And that gap is really important. He says that in that gap, that's where liturgy takes place. Mm-hmm. And I think that preaching is one of those places where it's like a spark plug. And my job, I can't close the gap. I don't want to close the gap. My job is to enable people to have a spark between themselves and the God who's inviting them into a relationship. And I'm trying to help spark that dialogue and that. But I can't do that as an outsider or as a superior or as somebody who's not a sinner. And I even in my own preaching often say, well, not real often, but admit the preaching is actually part of my spiritual journey. It's how I'm trying to work out my own connecting that gap.
Right.
So it's very personal.
Yeah. It has to be personal. Yeah. Or it doesn't get received. No one reaches back if it's not personal.
I agree.
Beautiful. Do you want to tell me a little bit about how you prepare for homilies? Like, what do you do?
Well, I try to do theological reflection. And the first thing I try to do is, and I have some leisure because I'm no longer teaching full time, and I'm not working in a parish where folks sometimes have to be celebrating Mass 2 and 3 times a day, and funerals and weddings, and it's exhausting. But I try to look at the not just the readings for the whatever Sunday or feast, but also look at the liturgy itself, because the liturgy itself is a resource there. So I try to look at that material. And then for me, one of the most important parts is what one of my students used to call stewing. And that is thinking about, and this is part of not just immediate preparation, but remote preparation. I think preachers, I'm always on the lookout for a story, for an analogy, for a scientific breakthrough, for some, YouTube. There was a thing on YouTube the last couple of weeks about this Little League baseball game where a kid got beamed by the pitcher. I don't know if you saw that. And the pitcher was, maybe he was 13 years old or something, of course, felt terrible. And the kid eventually goes to first base. And in the middle of the game, he knows that this pitcher is still upset. He leaves first base and goes over and hugs him. And you're going,
I did see that. It was really
right. So this is the kind of stuff that you keep in your, and actually I write these things down, and I have a resource of things that I can pull out of. And then you read about these readings and these texts, and then you stew, and then you look around what's happening, and you listen to the news, and you begin to get images, or you begin to get leads, like this coming story or this coming week. One of the sections in Luke's gospel is about the narrow gate. How do you preach about a narrow gate? And I go online and I do a lot of work on, there's a great blog called textweek.com. I used that enormous amount. And there was one blogger in there who said, I think a contemporary way to think about the narrow gate is a turnstile. Mm-hmm. And I began reading about turnstiles and what they do and what their benefits are. And they count every individual, and they force you to get rid of your baggage. I mean, when I would go to O'Hare Airport, I would often try to get my roller bag through the turnstile, and I would always get stuck. You can't get through with baggage. And then how do you play with that image and then discover that the turnstile is not a thing, but it's a person? And it's Jesus. And he's the turnstile. And the people that he loved and the people that got overlooked. And so I began developing images, sketching out ideas, and then began to say, okay, this is the order in which I'm going to do them. And then to try to do it in such a way that I do not want the community to know from the beginning where I'm going. Because if they know where I'm going, they'll turn it off and go back to their cell phone or read the bulletin or whatever. But I like to, the famous Eugene Lowry in his book on the homiletic plot says, there's got to be an oops in there someplace where people go, what do you mean? How do you do that? How do you fix that? Where do you go? And then you weave a resolution with them, and you keep them on the journey, the homiletic journey with you.
And some of that, I think, is sharing your own vulnerability with people. That, you're, the smelling the sheep, you're in the boat with them, you understand the difficulties, I'm always fascinated by homilies that say, you should go to confession. So go to confession. Well, what's keeping me from going to confession? What's the reality of the difficulty there? And so trying to push for homilies that say, well, why don't we go? Why don't we? Because all of us don't like that. So what keeps us? What is the fear, the confusion? So getting in there and trying to not simplify a situation.
And even when one is preaching about the sacrament of reconciliation, that that is a ritual gate that is part of a larger ritual reality. I mean, liturgically, the first sacrament of reconciliation is Eucharist. So if people are at Eucharist, they are already, and they may not be aware of it, already being invited into reconciliation, into reconciling acts, sort of cracking open the ritual event itself. And that the church has discovered that one-to-one reconciliation is a powerful grace and balm, but it's part of this larger spectrum of reconciliation that the church has to offer.
Right. So we're just that offering of the reconciliation, the love, the grace.
Right.
It's really a beautiful story that we're involved in, and that homily gives you this opportunity to invite people into that deeper relationship of the story,
and also into the great resources of the church. I mean, sometimes because we haven't done due diligence and study and understanding, that we forget both our rich traditions. We have a very pluriform tradition, but even around reconciliation, Thomas Aquinas, the great Dominican theologian, says, confession to a lay person is a useful thing. And how do we invite people to start enacting that they're what Paul calls, apostles of reconciliation. So it's not simply going to confession, but being a reconciler. And especially in our families, because that's usually the place where reconciliation is the most obviously needed.
Well, the families where we, in one way or another, we all live out our life,
right?
As family, whether it's the immediate family or extended family, dealing with children, the parish family. I mean, that's where the rubber hits the road. I love everybody except my neighbor.
Families.
I love everybody except for, my cousin, Joe. So, yeah, that's that, it was interesting during the pandemic, families suddenly thrown together 24/7, living out the gospel message, trying not to kill each other. My husband and I went from, I was working at the seminary 2 days a week, and he was at work 5 days a week, and we had weekends together and most evenings, but not all, to being in a house 24/7. The first 3 months were interesting, I'll tell you. And of course, we weren't going to mass either. So, that immediate grace and, having to give peace to each other at daily mass was gone. So I really want to receive the Eucharist. So we have to say, the peace to each other. And so that was gone. And, 3 months without the Eucharist, and 24/7 in a house. The gospel came right home.
Well, those are very widespread experiences that continually we can draw upon. COVID is still very, very fresh, and it seems to me that's one of those places where we can preach about broadly experienced, general experiences that we can share with each other, and recognize our common humanity and our common frailty and vulnerability and sinfulness, and with some humor, like you did, but with great seriousness, and saying, in what context how does God self-reveal?
Yeah,
And in ways we don't imagine.
it was hard. It was hard going. Yeah.
Sure.
But for me, it was interesting. I suddenly was not teaching, but for 5 years I had been talking about writing, and now I had time to write. So God shut one door, opened another door. So when I look back on it now, I smile.
I understand.
No divorce, no murder, still here.
Absolutely.
Is there anything else that you would like? We've touched on all sorts of things sort of all over. Your book is wonderful. I highly recommend it. And here it is for those who can, I don't know if I can see this clearly.
Sure.
But
Thank
it's, I haven't read all of it, but I've read most of it and really enjoyed it. Is there anything else you'd like to share that's really important to you specifically in the book before we close?
Well, one of the comments that I've gotten from some of my my great peer mentors, I had a number of people read drafts of this thing, and they all weren't clergy, and they all weren't men, and they all weren't white. And I mean, I tried to get input from all sorts of groups, is that the methods or the strategies, the spiritualities behind preaching, effective preaching, I don't think there's such a thing as successful preaching. I don't think success is the right language for ministry. I think it's about effectiveness. Jesus was not the most successful rabbi in his generation, but he was quite effective. Is that there should be resonance between the preaching ministry and our approaches and our methods with every other ministry we do. One of my concerns with teaching ordination candidates and lay women and men who are getting ministerial degrees is that they often have a method for doing pastoral ministry, and they may have a method for doing biblical exegesis, and they may have a method for doing this, and then they may have a method for preaching. And it seems to me that if we're going to develop some kind of integration and grow on the integrating journey, is that we have to have fundamental way that we do all of this with some cohesion. And that's why, for me, the underlying method is not just about preaching. The underlying method is about how do we make the spiritual journey, about how do we do ministry, whether that's in a kind of official context or all of the ad hoc kinds of ministries that people engage in. Is that we have to keep doing the theological reflection that says, where is God here? What does our context say about how God reveals? What do our religious traditions say about this? How does this engage with other folks' belief systems? So that the preaching becomes not just an 11-minute or 7-minute or 35-minute event on a Sunday morning, but it actually becomes one of the beacons of a more integrated spirituality.
Right.
So that our preaching and our ministry and our spiritual life are cohesive, and they're in an integrating process and not simply the siloed parts of our lives, which unfortunately happens too often, I think, in people in full-time ministry.
Well, your preaching has to be reflective of your whole life. I completely agree that this integration, that's where you find the wholeness and the healthiness. That's why I say, sometimes people say to me with my children's books, how long did it take you to write this book? And 60 years, because every part of my journey, all of the life is in that book. I may have, the actual writing may have been a few months, but the bigger picture of the writing was my whole life. You know, my childhood's in there, and my experiences in different countries are there, and the people I've met are in there. So yeah, that integration of your life and your preaching and all the other ministries should all be somehow integrated, and you know, when they get separated out, things get very weird, especially in the pulpit.
Well, and even when we shape preachers, do we give them some kind of separate method for preaching, or do we find out what are the fundamental methods that they have, approaches for ministry itself, and how does preaching flow from that, rather than have some kind of separate methodological pathway that isn't pursued in any other ministry we do? And I think we don't do ministerial students and those on a preaching path any service by doing that kind of work. It seems to me inviting them into the broader frame of theological reflection as the foundation for a spiritual journey is maybe more contributory.
And I liked your idea that you mentioned earlier about letting ideas stew, you know, that stewing process that takes place when you're driving the car, when you're taking a shower, when you're cooking dinner or doing the dishes. And I always recommend those times for prayer as well. Those are great times for contemplative prayer. People say, like, you know, when you're changing the baby's diaper, when you're doing the dishes, and those are times for stewing of preaching and stewing of prayer, and then it all does sort of flow together as one concept.
I mean, I listen to a lot of audibles. It's one of the ways, because I have to do so much other reading, that my reading for expanding my mind is more through audibles. And when you're in that stewing process and you're listening to a great book about perception, or about finding the mother tree, or a great piece of fiction, all of a sudden you get this image that says, yes, I had never thought about it that way before. I just finished listening to An Immense World by Ed Yong about perception, and all of a sudden you're listening to something about how spiders or moles or snakes perceive their environment, and you get this insight that you would have never looked that up if you were working on this homily, but it comes as a grace.
It does.
So staying open to this broad kind of remote preparation that allows us to stew, and you never know what leper, what Jesus, what Martha and Mary, what Baptist, what Pilate is going to come into your life.
Right.
And each one of those just cracks it open.
Yep. He's amazing, this God.
Right.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me. It was a joy to have this conversation with you.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Would you end us with a prayer, please?
Sure. Father, we thank you for these graced moments, for the opportunity to speak about your incarnate word, and more for the invitation to allow that incarnate word to be again resonant in our hearts, that we might burn with the fire of your Spirit to the goodness of all humanity and the glory of your name. We make this prayer in the strong name of the Christ, who is Lord and God forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
And delightful.